Welcome. I'm Hernan Murdoch. In this episode, we're going to provide some tips once you realize that you need to produce a written product, what that process is going to entail. So let's take a look. So, Kathleen, you have been very helpful so far with so many aspects of the internal audit process. And I'm thinking about an auditor who is now getting ready to produce a report and needs to go through that process. We spoke a bit about some of the qualitative elements associated with it, but what about the process itself? Can you help?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Okay, so tell us a bit more about that process and how that works.
Well, here is an overview of the writing process, and this applies to all kinds of writing. There's often a period of pre-writing, but in the context of audit reports, we're probably going to outline a few things. We'll have a template to work with, and then comes the drafting. Drafting of the area processor system and what kinds of results we had in that particular audit. So drafting should be thought of as just a data dump. Put all the information into your draft because refinement is going to come later. We want to separate the creative thinking from the critical thinking so that we make sure that we don't mix the two and therefore kind of get ourselves in a knot. So after drafting comes some revision. And then some editing. So revision is more about flow, and editing is more about specific word choice, proper grammar, a few other things like that. Also, I want folks to notice that even though this is a straight line through, there's likely to be a couple of loops, especially in revision and editing, and that's absolutely natural. And once we come out of the last edit, which might be yours or might be someone else's, because in auditing we often have our reports reviewed by others, we'll publish and you can have a party. So
Okay, so it sounds like there's a reason to separate the logical from the creative aspects of the writing itself, and that there needs to be a way of really thinking it through. So what does that entail, separating the logical from the creative?
Sure. Well, I rely a lot on the work done by Betty Sue Flowers. So on this graphic, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of her process. She said that we have 4 writing energies. So these 4 writing energies allow us to separate the creative thinking from the critical thinking. The first part of the process is to generate ideas and gather facts, gather data. That gathering part is very much what we're doing as auditors. We've gone through this audit and we have these facts and figures that we want to share with others. So let's pull them all together, get them into one place. And professional writers say your objective here is actually to write a very messy first draft, which is going to sound weird, but that's actually your objective. Can we get everything into this, I'll use another metaphor, into this lump of clay, because later on we're going to shape it.
Okay.
It's a very hard temptation to resist, though. I know
It's counterintuitive.
it is counterintuitive. It's so difficult. But if we can get better at setting aside, knowing that we're going to have the opportunity to do the organization later, that's great. The second focus should be on organization, establishing the logic, categorizing your points. So now we're starting to refine what we are doing, but it's a very high level or almost go back to my metaphor about sculpture. We're chipping away at the bigger blocks that don't fit so that we start to see the shape of the piece of writing.
I
Then
like that analogy.
yeah, it's like Michelangelo said that the angel was always in the block of marble. He just had to chip it out, and that's what we're
All
doing
right.
with our writing.
Excellent.
The third phase is to refine clarity and flow of the paragraphs and the sentences. So these are the bigger blocks of writing. Can we make things flow better? Because remember, we've talked about tuning into your readers and what they need from you. So we want to make sure that we are telling a story of what we did, what we found, and what we concluded, and so that the story is very, very clear to all readers, regardless of their level of involvement from the beginning. And finally, the fourth phase is to polish. Polishing is about revision. It's about correcting details. It's about establishing some flow, and making sure that it feels and sounds correct, and that you've also done things that will, quote unquote, guide the eye of the reader. You've put things in places where they expect to find them. Your sentences flow into paragraphs, and your paragraphs flow into the entire document. So we have to also give ourselves a little bit of time in between each of these phases, because you're going to notice things as you come back to the document that you'd like to make some changes. So you want to be able to do those before you move on to the next phase.
I found that to be very helpful writing, where you leave it alone for a while. It could be just during lunch in some cases, it could be overnight in other cases, but I found that to be very helpful, just because when you come back, your frame of mind is a little bit different, you see things differently, and so on. So that can be very, very helpful to break, in some cases, even a writer's block too. It's not just that you don't feel like writing or you can't seem to get the words out. You're writing fine. It's just that you probably need just to get a little bit different perspective, and that rest can be very, very helpful there. So as we are putting it all together then, and we're moving into organization of the thoughts and everything, let's talk a bit about readability. So how can we make it more easier for the reader to follow through and understand and get the message you're trying to convey?
Yes. I think we have to think about form and substance when it comes to readability. So some of these things have to do with how it looks, and some of these things have to do with how it sounds and how it's said. So at the top part of the graphic, we're talking about, margins and white space and a few of the graphical elements of documents. And these matter because we don't know enough about all of our readers to know how they're going to consume this content. There are many people who will read this on screens, and if they need to, they will make it bigger or smaller as they so choose. But we have other readers who may choose to print this out and read an actual document. So we need to make sure that we manipulate, and I'm using this intentionally, manipulate the margins, the white space, the headings, the bullets, and so forth, so that both types of people can consume this content easily.
Right. And it's also pleasant to the eye. Another
Yes.
tip that I heard many years ago was to not look at the words for a moment. Just take the document and step back away from it, whether it is on the screen, soft copy, or hard copy, but just step away, a few feet away from it, and see what it looks like. And if it just looks like a big clump of ink, just very tight margins, very little white space, it may not be very pleasant. So you open it up a little bit and you make it pleasant to the eye, maybe even add. It's becoming far more common over the years, and continue to leverage that and visuals and graphics that can make it more appealing and draw the reader into the document as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So these graphical devices really do make a big, big difference. With regard to things like bullets and typeface variety and headings, I would be careful not to go overboard with some of the more creative things that are out there in terms of variety, styles, mixing it up, because again, we want it to be a practical document, pleasing to the eye, but this is not about, releasing your inner artistic leprechaun. It's really about focusing on what's going to be meaningful and helpful to our readers.
Exactly.
And then with regard to the substance, I zero in on short words, short sentences, short paragraphs. These are going to make the document much, much, much more readable for our readers. And active voice as well. So for folks who don't know, there is a tool within Word. if that's what you're using for your word processing, and most of us are, called the readability tool, and it's part of your grammar and spelling checker. So if you check that box off, every time you check on or hover over spelling and grammar checker, you will get a report. And that report will tell you how readable your document is. And it's based exactly on word count, character count, sentence count, paragraph count, as to whether or not this is readable by most people. And you're looking at I can only speak to the American version of Word, but I presume that there's a similar tool in other languages. So we want to be mindful of trying to strike a balance that is consumable by most people. There's a piece of research from a translation firm called Claro, which says that for every native English speaker, there are 3 people for whom English is a second, third, or fourth language. So it's important that we be very, very cognizant of the needs of all readers. And then active voice is for me, this is the epitome of good writing. Active voice is sentence construction that is shorter, more direct. It's very, very helpful and expected in most business communications. So it's the difference between saying the auditor wrote the report versus the report was written by the auditor. In the first instance, more direct, and certainly shorter by a couple of words. And that's what we're aiming for.
Right. It makes you sound more confident as well, as you're right. So it's another interesting element around tone that is triggered by that active or passive voice. So we have the content there and the presentation and so on, but how about flow? Does it flow well? Can we talk about that?
Yes. So in terms of flow for us, the flow has to have some logic behind it. And there are a few different ways in which we might accomplish that. So here are a few hints. You have to defer to whatever your particular audit group does, but I would say that within your audit group, you're probably going to see some of these things that come across as advice as you're learning more about how to write in the organization that you work for. So first is about telling the story. Thesis, evidence, rationale. What's the thesis? This area processor system was supposed to work in a particular way. It either was or was not. And then what's our recommendation? Telling the story. So telling the story, again, is not focusing on the auditors. People are not interested in, it was Tuesday and I did a such and such statistical analysis and this is what I found. None of that. Another logical flow is most important first. That's pretty typical in audit reports. We don't, the phrase that they use in media, in printed media, is don't bury the lead. So we lead with what is most important first, and then things of lesser importance, but still important enough to be in the audit report, follow. You may have different observations in different contexts, but look for the opportunity to group like with like. So if you have similar observations or points to make, is there some way to put this together and link it? I would also argue that provide enough context, but emphasis on the enough, not more than necessary, but try to strike that balance. And as we talked about before, the framework for our issues memos is a great thing to lean into here. CCCER, what's the criteria? So what did you expect to see? What's the condition? What did you see? What's the cause of any gap between the two? And then what's the effect or the consequence of that gap? What's the recommendation or corrective action that you're putting forward?
Excellent. Yes, it helps you organize your thoughts and provides a sequencing to the elements so that you can go from what was expected to what was found, to why it was found, why it matters, and what should be done about it. So it provides that continuum in a logical sense as well.
Yeah. And then the bottom line, of course, is the last point on the graphic. We want to make sure that we are using our different sections appropriately, and that we're not muddying up or confusing matters by putting some tangent comments in places where they don't belong.
Right. Okay. So the headings also matter a lot, so they can help guide the reader into what is in that particular section.
Yes.
And keep the thoughts organized. Once again, keeping it logical. So as we go through this process and as we decide what we want to say, how we want it to look, and how we want to structure it, how do we make sure we don't go overboard so that we don't end up with wordiness, so that we end up with something where we just keep going and going and going and we can't seem to get to the end of it.
Right.
So how do we minimize wordiness?
Well, I think there's a few things to keep in mind. And if we, in fact, begin with the end in mind, to quote Stephen Covey, we bring ourselves back to the needs of the readers. So let's be careful with language that's vague or repetitive or pretentious. Let's reduce longer clauses to shorter phrases, reduce phrases to single words where possible. Avoid sentence openers like there is, there are, there were. These really don't add anything, and they kind of water down your meaning, at least in this context. So I'd like to just pause here and say that we've learned how to write in a very academic way, and some of these things are asking us to overcome some habits that we have long established. So it's not easy, but this checklist hopefully will give you a sense of some things to pay attention to. Don't overwork your modifiers. These are your adjectives and adverbs. Avoid redundancies. So anything that's repetitive, look at that really, really carefully. And then use active verbs, and active verbs go with active voice that we saw on previous graphic. Use active verbs, make them vivid, make them really specific and meaningful.
Excellent. Yes, definitely very good suggestions. And I've noticed with word processing software, they've been getting a lot better now, where they are now providing some suggestions on how to rewrite and rephrase things. But we should not just lean on the software to tell us, but we should also make sure we understand why it's doing that and how it applies to what we do as auditors. So are there any other suggestions that come to mind as we're talking about reducing wordiness?
I think it's a good idea to really look at your own style and be honest with yourself, asking whether or not you're accomplishing your objectives. Did you write in a way that's logical and thorough, anticipating what people need? So this too is a really good, these are really good rules of thumb. But to your point about wordiness, I'd say go back to the readability guide and see if it appears that the grade level is creeping up. And maybe more toward academic writing, and see if we can't cut back on some of the modifiers or the phrases that are not particularly helpful.
Great. Well, thank you very much, because this has been very helpful in trying to better understand the process itself, right? We understand some of the standards and what they say, but trying to put it in practice is the how that we definitely ask you to help us out, and you have been great so far, giving us all these great ideas on how we can make sure that the process of writing is better and that we can convey the message we intend to communicate to our readers so that we can achieve the intended results. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
It is my pleasure.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit-related content.